Good day, everybody, and thank you so much for participating in this very timely and interesting conversation regarding where we are with the climate agenda, and in particular, how that relates to the African continent. We have an amazing panel today, distinguished panel, if I may say so, that is going to help us just work through some of the conversations that came in particular out of the last 2 weeks of discussions at the COP26 in Glasgow. Before I get into the details of what we're going to be discussing today and introduce our first few speakers, I would just like to set the ground rules for our panelists. I know you are all A-types. I know you're all passionate about Africa. I know you are all involved in the impact of climate around Africa and our populations and our future going forward. So what I do ask is that, as passionate as we are, in order to keep the conversation interesting and engaging, please keep your submissions concise and straightforward. Kindly ensure your microphone is muted when you're not speaking and unmuted when you are. This you have to do manually. And please keep your videos on throughout the session. And would also encourage that your desktop notifications and any other devices around you are muted in order to avoid noise as we proceed. To the participants, the most important part of this conversation, we will be reading out audience questions during the Q&A session. Please leave your questions in the comments section on your screen. Our team will be following and collating them in order for me to come back during the Q&A session and use those. And we strongly encourage you. This is an incredibly important conversation for Africa. We strongly encourage you, those of you following on social media, to tag us at ACET for Africa and at NEPAD agency with your questions for the panel and any comments that you may have. I will ask our technology team to put those into the chat, the addresses to which you send those commentary, so that we can receive as much of your commentary as possible and as wide a coverage as possible. And so today we are going to be talking about the impact of the outcomes of the COP26 discussions. Our speakers will reflect on the outcomes and expectations for progress on key climate issues in the wake of COP26. There are a number of issues that were at the table and for discussion. There's the climate finance issue. What more is needed to close the climate finance gap? We know that at the last COP, I think it was 2015, COP21, where $100 billion was pledged to close the finance gap. That $100 billion did not go as we had expected it to go into disbursements and actual projects that were going to close that gap. At the last COP, I know that we were talking about trillions. So the $100 billion has moved into trillions for funding of projects that are going to help us to close adaptation, mitigation, and resilience gaps in Africa. So what progress? What has been made at COP in this regard? What can we expect? The second area we're going to discuss is accountability. There is a big conversation around who is to blame and who is accountable. So what tangible progress has been made globally since the inception of COP in 1999 in addressing the challenges posed by climate change? Has COP26 been a turning point? Will it be a turning point? We will also ask our audience about resilience. What efforts have been made on building resilience to climate change in Africa and indeed across the globe, but we are focused here on Africa? How have the most vulnerable, particularly the women and girls, been affected, and what needs to be done differently, if indeed anything needs to be done differently, and how can we scale up the efforts that have been made so far? Another area that is very important is the area of narrative. Narrative, education, awareness. How is climate reflected in the conversations of ordinary African citizens? According to the last statistics that I saw, it ranges between 50% and 88% of our population being aware of the conversation of climate change and how it impacts Africa. In some countries, amongst the youth who are the future of this continent and for whom this becomes very important, it comes as low as 49% in terms of awareness. I'm sure one of our panelists, Moki, whom many of you know, will be able to tell us about the storytelling and how important this is, and whether it is working and how we can make it work better in terms of how African voices are heard about the risks that climate poses for the continent. And we will also listen eventually to climate risk adaptation and mitigation. What are some examples of innovation in Africa addressing adaptation, mitigation as solutions to the adversities that we face vis-a-vis climate risk? So with that, I would like to say I was at COP, and I would like to say my takeaways were really 4 points, maybe 5 points. The first is these billions to trillions that have been given to us as headline goals. How do we access them? How do we account for them? How do we make sure that they address the challenges that we are facing? That's number one. The second issue that really I took away was this blame game. We are so focused on who is to blame, and I wonder if that is taking away from the actual solutions and the action that needs to happen. I liken this to being on a sinking ship in the middle of the high seas, and the captain and the bosun are arguing about whose fault it is that the ship is sinking. Well, all I want to know is, what are we going to do about the fact that the ship is sinking? I don't care whose fault it is. The third, of course, is the resilience issue, in addition to mitigation and adaptation. And then finally, I'd love for us to kickstart this thing and this conversation around the nexus between climate and gender, and how we bring those two together, should indeed they be brought together. I spoke about the awareness piece, and we will get to that. With that, I would like to introduce two individuals, and we will move in quick succession from one to the other. The first is Dr. Nick Westcott. Nick has been a member of ACET. ACET is a co-convener of this organization, as you well know, together with NEPAD. And he knows Africa well. He is Africa to every intent and conversation. And Nick, we are really ready to hear your remarks from the global perspective, but also from the Africa perspective, marrying that with the international portfolio that you hold, and how we really position Africa within this climate agenda, particularly with the outcomes that have just come out of COP26. Nick will be immediately followed by, and I will not do an introduction because we have limited time for both of them, will immediately be followed by Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki. I am not doing introductions of these people. They are in the chat. And for those of you who have signed up, their bios are very clearly put out there. And we are really privileged to have Dr. Mayaki give us the time, and he will give us the opening remarks from a NEPAD perspective. I also want to acknowledge that we have on the team, on the panel, KY Amwako, who is the founder and the brains behind ACET, and I will call on him at the end of this conversation. So if you have conversation in terms of the Africa Center for Economic Transformation and where it interacts with climate change, please prepare them. He will be available towards the end of the conversation. And without further ado, I would like to call on Nick to give us a 5-minute intervention, followed through with Dr. Mayaki. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dolika, for that introduction, and particularly for your impressions from COP26, which I also visited briefly. I think one thing we often don't acknowledge, and which COP26 helped to underline, is that climate is actually at the heart of everything we do. And we often make assumptions about it. We make assumptions that it will remain relatively constant, particularly in economics. There has been a tendency, you build your models assuming, as they call it, ceteris paribus, and it is increasingly evident that those assumptions are not sound, that we have to build in assumptions that the climate is changing and will continue to change, and we have to take that into account. This is why climate is central to everything that ACET does. Over the last decade, ACET has been taking an independent view of the critical issues that will enable Africa's transformation. And again, at the beginning of that time, maybe we too were making this kind of assumptions that there will be a relatively stable global economic environment and climate environment both those are coming under question. And that makes the challenge of achieving this transformation even greater. ACET's work on agriculture, on trade, on the specific areas has increasingly taken into account the challenge that climate produces. And its flagship, the African Transformation Reports, have shown a growing preoccupation with this issue. And the latest one, just produced only a month or two ago, Integrating to Transform. If you haven't read it, I'm sure we'll put the link in the chat, but it's essential reading. It has a whole section on managing the climate risk. It is an integral part of integrating to transform. Climate is something that respects no borders, obviously. And it doesn't end at national boundaries. That's part of the core message at COP, but it's equally critical in terms of economic policy making. To manage the change in these patterns and the impacts they're having, not just on the physical environment, but on the human environment. And I think that's really important, because it is people responding to the facts that climate is changing that we have to take into account in the policies that we develop. And that makes regional cooperation and regional integration, all which is central to this third ATR transformation report, absolutely crucial. And the key message I take away from this is that we cannot wait for the money. We can't say, give us the money and we'll make the change. The change is happening throughout Africa. Governments have to take that into account in what they're doing. Now, wearing another hat, I was involved in organizing a conference in September on climate, conflict, and demography in Africa, because those three things can't actually be separated. And we organized it with the Royal African Society, the International Crisis Group, and Africa Confidential. And we had about 1,000 participants from across the continent, across the globe, actually. And just to highlight 4 key points from that conference. Firstly, it is already clear that climate is exacerbating conflict and displacement, I call it. Migration in another word, but sometimes it is displacement for climate reasons, for conflict reasons, for conflict because of climate reasons. Climate change doesn't create conflict, but it exacerbates the potential causes, and where there is a conflict makes it harder to resolve. Second conclusion was we have to measure this impact of climate change, and we're not doing that enough yet. And again, it's something that we'll be working with the UN Economic Commission for Africa to try and push forward, because we don't realize the scale of it already unless we are measuring it. Thirdly, that Africa's top priority is actually to stop the pace of change, to reduce carbon emissions. And that's why the conclusions of COP about whether we're phasing out coal or not matter. Obviously, they matter to South Africa that's using coal. It matters to Nigeria, who are dependent, and Angola, who are dependent on revenues from fossil fuels to fuel their development. But the pace of change of climate divergence has to be slowed. Otherwise, Africa is the first to be impacted. But fourth point, the money does matter. And therefore, the commitments that have been made to increase the funding, or at least accelerate the funding for Africa on adaptation and the rest, is very important. But equally important is how it is spent. In fact, more important is how it is spent. And there, African governments have to do a lot to join up amongst themselves within their own governments. Often we have the Environment Ministry doing stuff without any reference to defense, home affairs, trade, energy. All those are integrated, and African governments have to make that step. And likewise, regionally. There's no point one country doing something when the change is across the whole region. Secondly, it has to go on an energy transition, an accelerated but just energy transition. Thirdly, we have to focus on conserving the biodiversity. And fourthly, we actually have to educate people, both so they're aware of what is happening. And secondly, they have the skills to adapt. So those were the 4 points. And I think now when we turn to the conclusions of COP, we'll see to what extent they were able to respond to those 4 requirements. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. Right on the dot. And with that, Dr. Mayaki, please, we are waiting for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ulrike. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. Let me congratulate, well, we congratulate ourselves for co-organizing this event. But the leading role of ACET as a think tank in the continent is more and more recognized. So COP26 was considered as the most consequential COP since the Paris Agreement of 2015. The outcomes of the summit have been a mixed bag for Africa, I should say, with some promising decisions in the Glasgow Climate Pact. I will allude to some of the points regarding the Glasgow Climate Pact. On adaptation, I think the fact that it featured very strongly at this COP and was given serious attention during the negotiations, I think it's a form of win for Africa. It hadn't been featured in that way previously. And the main factors that did reference to adaptation in this Glasgow Climate Pact include the urgency of scaling up action and support to enhance adaptive capacity, reduce vulnerability to climate change, reaffirmation that continuous and enhanced international support shall be provided to developing country parties. Okay. Now, the implications for Africa are, because adaptation has been largely ignored up to now within the negotiations in favor of mitigation, a key decision which summarizes countries' commitments to address adaptation as a priority, I think is an important point for Africa. We are the region which is the closer to being a net zero in terms of emissions. So we shouldn't forget that. Now, the GPC noted that current provisions, when we go to finance, or climate finance for adaptation is insufficient, but we know that in order to respond to worsening climate change impacts in developing country parties. So there is likely to be an increase in finance, as you were mentioning, for adaptation projects. Whilst it sounds exciting and will assist African countries to have access to additional funding for climate adaptation interventions, we should remain cautiously optimistic and measured in our expectations, because we have seen the antecedents. And as you were mentioning, the antecedent of $100 billion per year by 2020, but was made in 2009. And we have the numbers, we know what happened. So it is likely that most of the funding to be made available will be channeled through the private sector and multilateral development banks, through loans over complex financial instruments, etc. But African countries should also build their own capacity to independently verify climate funding that is spent in the continent, rather than relying in figures which are disseminated by developed country parties. I think it's an important point. Now, on the issue of phasing down on fossil fuels, the Glasgow Climate Pact calls for this expression, phasing down of unabated coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Many African countries continue to discover and develop more oil and gas resources. So the phasing down should rather than phasing out, serves also the benefit of some of the continent big oil nations, such as Nigeria, Angola, and Algeria. And the the bigger question for many African countries is creating an internal demand within Africa for their oil and gas resources, as the traditional clients in the developed countries have set targets of ending fossil fuel use by a certain time. So, and I think where the African Continental Free Trade Area could provide the needed mechanisms to ensure that Africa makes the best use of its fossil fuel resources before it becomes globally unattractive to do, whilst also, evidently, we need to also pursue renewable energy targets. Another key outcomes I would like to refer to is regarding the Congo Basin Joint Donor Statement, which announced an initial collective pledge of at least $1.5 billion of financing between 2021 and 2025 to support the ambitious efforts in the Congo Basin region. I think it's a good point, and we are going to be part of that as the Development Continental Agency. And it's very important, to protect, maintain the forest, peatlands, and other critical carbon stores. Another point is the agreement on the Article 6 of the carbon market mechanisms. We know that the most contentious article of the Paris Agreement that delayed the finalization of the Paris Rulebook, which is the operational framework document to guide the implementation of the Paris Agreement. This was in principle concluded. So the implications for Africa is that capacity in understanding the carbon market, we know it is lacking significantly on the continent. So we should really develop intensive and robust capacity development strategies in order to make sure that Africa is not short as it was during the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. So these are the points I wanted to highlight. Finally, it is important for us as we join our efforts. I think we should agree on a coherent framework to assess countries' progresses towards the national development plans and Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. You mentioned that in the introduction. We should have clarity on how we make progresses. And as a solution, AUDA-NEPAD, in support of ACET's transformation report on scaling up renewable energy, promoting climate smart agriculture, sustaining green and blue ecosystems, we can support the reform structure and the challenges which are associated with the transition. So these are the points I wanted to highlight. Are we at a turning point? You asked the question. I think we should build our own progressive turning points as we move ahead. And it means, and it's a good signal that I felt from COP26, we are increasing the ownership of our development strategies. And not only in terms of thinking, but also in terms of systems which are being put in place. And it's a long way to go, but I think we are on the right track. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayaki, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. A call of action, a call of responsibility, a call of ownership, a call of leadership on the part of Africans from Dr. Mayaki there, stating that Africa is near net zero emitter in the perspective of things, and yet we are being asked as a continent to make the hardest sacrifices. How do we balance the challenge of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables? There are real implications for people, for government policies, for business people in how we do that. Asking, again, calling for a build-up in capacity and skills in terms of the carbon market. How do we engage ourselves in that from a position of knowledge, So we are not the commodity that is being traded, but we are part of the traders of a commodity that actually we hold in the highest power. We are net zero emitters. Talking about COP26 being probably the most consequential since Paris. And so really challenging us out there as the African continent and participants in the African story to take the mantle, pick up the mantle, be in the driver's seat for how this conversation lands and the consequences for it. We heard from Nick Westcott. Climate is at the heart of all that we do, and climate respects no borders. Really appreciate that statement, Nick. Guiding us through the Africa Transformation Report on climate risk and how this is critical to economic policy, economic development for the future of this continent, giving us the interrelatedness and the importance of measurement between climate, conflict, and demographies. So thank you to our two introductory speakers. And Nick, your last point that I thought was very, very important is that indeed the money does matter. So as we said, from 100 billion a year to trillions, let us see that on the continent of Africa. Thank you so much to both of you. With that, and again, I would like to take this opportunity to ask those participants to kindly start thinking about your questions, populating the chat with them so that we've got an amazing panel here. And I think we should use them and seize the moment to really ask any question that we have around this area. It is an area that something is specialized, but it is about our lives. So no question is a stupid question. Please put your questions in the chat. With that, I would like to go to our panelists. We have four amazing people that range in their expertise from development finance to hardcore insurance, to private equity, business advisory, through to, I don't know how to call this one, but Africa No Filter. So tell the story of Africa, challenge the perceptions of Africa. And so Leslie, if you don't mind, I would like to take the first question to you. And, you know, my question to you, we have heard about adaptation and mitigation, which was the first baby, then adaptation, and now resilience, that we are all focusing on a little bit more. It's receiving less attention than the other two, but I know that as African Risk Capacity CEO, your end game is really to build the resilience. So what is currently being done to help communities become more resilient to climate shocks? What is being done? What more can be done? What do you need from the community that is on this call today to really make this happen? Leslie?
Thank you very much, Dalika. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Resilience is a very important piece of the discussion that we are having today. To me, resilience is about giving our people on the African continent the ability to bounce back from extreme climate shocks, which are increasing in frequency and severity. Resilience is about protecting people's livelihoods and also safeguarding the development gains that we have seen over the last few years. So to give a very practical example of how all of this works, agriculture is the mainstay of the African economy. Currently, it contributes about 1/3 to the overall GDP and contributes 2/3 of the, and employs 2/3 of the workforce, I should say. This means that quite a large chunk of the economic activity in Africa is exposed to extreme weather because this agriculture is very often rain-fed. So a solution to increase resilience on the African continent must address the needs of the agricultural sector. Within the African risk capacity, we have an ambition to increase the number of people that are covered by insurance, or to put it in plain language, the number of people that have access to pre-arranged financing, such that when a disaster happens, funding can be very quickly made available to them, enabling them to resume their economic activities and avoid the negative impact of extreme weather, such as droughts, floods, or tropical cyclones. We also work at the country level. Capacity building has been mentioned already a number of times. And we like to think of capacity building in a very structured way. The starting point is risk awareness, so working with a country so that they understand the risk that they face from climate change. Then it's about developing a contingency plan on how the country will deal with an event if it happened. It's also about developing the necessary skills within the country to coordinate large-scale disaster relief, and also to utilize the sophisticated financial instruments in terms of managing their exposure. And these instruments can be parametric insurance along the lines that is offered by the African Risk Capacity, which is in fact an insurance policy that pays out a claim based on a model. The model gives a very good approximation of the actual loss that has been suffered. And the advantage of using a model is that you are able to pay claims very quickly without having to wait for the traditional insurance approach of loss adjustment, which can take several months. And of course, while people are waiting for this loss adjustment process to occur, then the impact of the extreme weather can become worse. So using parametric insurance is, as an innovative instrument allows us to really accelerate the speed of the payouts. Then you ask a very good question on what else can we do? When you look at what's happening on the African continent, currently there are 20 to 30 million people that are covered by the various insurance and social protection schemes that exist all across Africa. But again, if you look at the need within Africa, which of 2/3 of the population, you're talking about 700 million people whose economic activities can be impacted by extreme weather. So of course, there needs to be a massive scaling up of insurance coverage. And part of this is working with institutions such as ourselves at the African Risk Capacity. But I hasten to add that it's not just about us, it's really about having an industry-wide consortium so that we progressively close the protection gap and increase the number of people that have access to insurance. Furthermore, there is a scope to work with other partners all across the financial sector, be it banks that are developing contingency type credit, which makes credit and loans available after the occurrence of an event. It could also be developmental financial institutions coming in to act as a catalyst within the market. And of course, it's the donor community as well that has played an important role in founding institutions such as ARC in the African context, but also CRIF for the Caribbean, PICRIC for the Pacific, because all these institutions are helping to implement a market solution which can make African communities a lot more resilient. When you look at the scale of the numbers that I've just quoted, 30 million of coverage per year versus a need of 700 million, it shows that we still have ways to go in terms of making pre-arranged financing more mainstream and accessible to all Africans that need it. And being able to achieve this is extremely important for Africa to be able to emerge out of the poverty trap and be better able to deal with the climate shocks, which inevitably will become increasingly more frequent and more severe. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to respond to any questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leslie. You see, panel, I did tell you that we have passionate people here, very passionate about what we're doing. So, Leslie, that was very, very clear. I mean, the compelling number of 20 to 30 million people protected and covered versus an ideal of the 700 million people, and insurance being just one of the means and the tools through which we can do this. Just led me to thinking about, and three things that I picked up from your presentation: protection of livelihoods, safeguarding the development gains and agendas for the SDGs, capacity building in a structured manner. This is all about people, planet, and partnerships. I think you have encapsulated those three Ps, as I like to call them, vis-a-vis the solutions to the climate issue that we face. I'm going to go, in actual fact, to Cesar Calderon next, because I think what Leslie has given us feeds very nicely into the global picture, into the international community, into the World Bank Group and its GFI communities, subsidiaries. And my question to you, Cesar, would be, the World Bank just released the Africa's Pulse report, and the findings were very much in line with ACET's recent transformation report, as was referenced by Dr. Mayaki. Could you please share with us the key takeaways from the World Bank's report? By the way, I'm an alumni of the World Bank Group, so great to see. I'm in the company of alumni here, from ACET to World Bank, and ARC Limited, so this is great. But could you please share with us the key takeaways from the report, and how optimistic are you as Cesar, but also as World Bank? I know Peru is where you hail from, and it also has faced a number of these issues. How confident are you that after COP, the recommendations out of the report will be acted upon?
Well, thank you so much for the question and the invitation, Dolika. Regarding the Africa's Pulse, I mean, if I can summarize the key takeaways from the report in two simple messages, are messages that I think most of the audience and most of the people in Africa know very well. One is that Africa is clearly bearing the brunt of climate change, although it contributes very little to it. Some calculations that we have show that Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for only 2 to 3% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions from energy and industrial sources. So it means that our development is not affecting the climate. It's the climate that is affecting our development. And that's why, and if there is inaction, not only in Africa, but also in the world, the costs of climate change are going to be even more significant for the Africa region. To have an idea of some of the findings that we have specifically in terms of what is the how climate change is affecting our economies, estimates show that if the temperature is, for instance, half a degree Celsius higher, monthly economic activity in Sub-Saharan Africa will contract by about 1%. And the other reason, the other important finding that we have is that climate hazards are becoming more frequent and more severe in the region. An estimate from international financial institutions show that the impact of a drought on medium-term growth in the region is about 8 times as high as that of countries outside the Africa region. Of course, as we said, climate change is amplifying the frequency and the impact of these shocks, but at the same time, these are shocks that are affecting disproportionately the poorest households across our countries, no? And with long-term impacts on health, on human capital, on economic activity. Talking about what Leslie was saying, even though the engines of growth across Sub-Saharan African economies are diversified, agriculture is still the largest sector, not only in terms of what it contributes to GDP, but also in what it contributes in terms of labor. And the fact that these climate hazards are becoming more frequent, whether it's droughts in East and Southern Africa, security threats, resources scarcity in the Sahel, they are increasingly connected to downside risks to agricultural productivity. No? The second message that we have in the report is more of a hope message, hopefully, which basically says that African countries can seize the opportunity provided by climate change to try to transform their economies and create jobs. There are several areas where African policymakers can make a difference. One would be the area of energy. If we think about achieving universal access to energy in sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about more than half of the population in the region that is not connected, that does not have access to energy. And this is simply unacceptable. And the average basically hides the fact that there are some countries like Chad or like Central African Republic that have even less than 20 or 10% access of energy. No? In this context, renewable energy can provide a solution. You know, the increased adoption of renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind, along with an expansion of the national grid, are critical to help achieve the goal of universal access. There are, I mean, one of the positive developments in terms of renewable energy is that across the continent, there are several firms that are offering already training for jobs in solar energy, and they're emerging and some of these startups are spreading all over Africa. No? For instance, you have the Green Solar Academy in South Africa and its partners that are basically providing training and workshops that cover the basics of how to run a solar business and how to do the system design. Infrastructure is another important area. In a region where much of the infrastructure, cities and transportation systems are yet to be built, investments in climate smart infrastructure can help cities to create jobs. No? The third area is what are the opportunities and the risks of decarbonization. I'm going to focus right now on the opportunities. And decarbonization is an opportunity to boost manufacturing in the region. Policymakers may want to implement policies over the medium term that should promote the manufacturing, for instance, of components of the Internet of Things and value addition to minerals that will power the green economy, say copper, coltan, cobalt, lithium, and insert into regional value chains. And I think I will stop here. Over to you, Dolika.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cesar. Again, lots to absorb there. My takeaway was in your opening statement that our development is not affecting the climate. It is climate that is affecting our development. I think that's such a profound statement and simple in its reality and its honesty. And I relate with what you say in terms of the impact of climate becoming higher and more severe, and the frequencies are also becoming higher and more severe and more costly, and disproportionately affecting the most disadvantaged of households amongst ourselves, which is the bulk of our population. Like your ending, that there are opportunities even in this misery, and we will get to that when we get to the narrative in my next but one panel member, and that is that there are opportunities we've seen. You mentioned decarbonization, but I'm sure that there are many other opportunities. With that, let me turn over to Mirabel. Mirabel, I have to mention that you have been on the, you are part of a fund called Injaro. And Injaro, for those who don't know, is derived from Kilimanjaro, which means the mountain of greatness. And so in all of what we're seeing, where there is misery, there is opportunity, and the phoenix rises out, and that is what Africa is. We always rise out of all sorts of adversities. I really would like to hear from you about what is the role, what is the funding need? And what is the role of the private sector, of the corporate sector, in terms of making a reality the hundreds of billions per annum or the trillions that are being pledged, and bringing those into our continent as we try to manage the scourge What are some of the investments that you are finding most promising in the climate space?
Well, thank you, Dalika, and thank you for the rest of the panelists as well, because the discussions and the submissions have been quite illuminating so far. So to parse out your question into, I think, 3 main parts. The first one is on the ultimate target. We've talked a lot over the past decade about 100 billion, making sure that's available, especially to the global south. And we missed this target in 2020, we missed it this year. And indications of scenario planning from the OECD indicates in 2023, we might finally make this target. So I think it's good to anchor on that number and have that every year going forward to plan around. And as to, the source of this funding, hands down, this catalytic funding is going to come from the public sector. If we take a step back and look at public goods in general, infrastructure, every country takes care of its roads, its bridges, and various initiatives. Here we have a situation, as Nick mentioned initially, that the climate has no boundaries. So this goes beyond the national boundaries and it becomes a global issue. So this is public funding, but at a global scale. And it's only when we start hitting this message home, especially to the global north, that this is not about a handout. This is responsible action being taken by all global citizens. And we have mentioned already on this panel that the global south is not the culprit when it comes to pollution. It's the global north. So in that case, this responsible action to clean up what has been started. But for me, more importantly, it's the focus on adaptation. When we sit back and look at the mobile phone trajectory in Africa, all the forecasts looking at landlines completely missed the margin because mobile phones were invented, and all of a sudden we have a myriad of financial service products which can reach the unbanked people in the most rural of areas because of the advancements we made with the mobile phones. So in the same way, I am a strong believer that we use the catalytic public sector funding for innovations. And this is what is going to make a significant difference for us in the global south. As Cesar mentioned, the energy use penetration in countries such as Chad. And so for Chad, for instance, we're not worried about coal and fossil fuels. We're more interested in what do they do now so they don't even begin to rely on coal to begin with. Those kinds of innovations is what are needed imminently, and it's really non-negotiable. And to the sectors that I find particularly interesting, it's on basic needs. We in the global south are spending over 80% of our resources on basic needs. And we already talked about agriculture, right? And with agriculture, we look at food security issues. We also just look at food wastage issues. And the last research that I saw from one of the international food research institutions indicated that about $700 billion are used annually for global subsidies. And definitely this is not coming from the global south, it's coming from the OECD. So when you juxtapose that against roughly about $16 billion, which is needed to ensure that not just the global south, but the entire world gets food secure, that we are able to maintain our water and our nutrient resources, then it's a no-brainer. How can we not reassign only 16 billion out of 700 billion per year to be able to have this result where everybody wins and it's not just about one divide versus the other? When we move away from food and water, the two other areas that for me are particularly promising are shelter. We've seen a lot of interesting innovations and initiatives come up. My issue with a lot of them is they're not necessarily scalable. So as prototypes, they're interesting. And again, this is where I would like to see a lot more of this catalytic public funding go to really help us identify those innovations which are really pushing the local use, the use of local raw materials and enhancing them, not in the raw form. Nobody wants to live in a mud hut. I've seen models of rammed earth buildings, but they're so expensive, they're not scalable. So we need more innovation to get these models scalable and affordable so that housing, which is the second big issue after food, is also addressed in a very climate smart manner. Then after that, we could look at clothing. We're having at least 5% of the emissions coming from the fashion industry. We're wearing clothes and buying them, using them less, repairing them less, and every season there's a change. And so we've developed as a world a very bad habit of when it comes to fashion. And this sensitization needs to start coming in. And I would love to hear what Moki would say about this, because we on the continent are gradually developing that same mindset, which is out west about seasonality of clothing, not to do with weather, but to do with trends. And we need to reorient ourselves so that we don't contribute to the climate issues significantly. So I just pause there and round off to say that we definitely need the funding. We need to see it yesterday, and we need leadership from the global north to really contribute their quota, given how we got to where we are now. Again, no blame, it's just facts. And we need to move forward and innovate so that we could, get to that 1.5 degree increase minimum or maximum per year that we desperately need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirabel, and very, very helpful thoughts. You summarized it yourself well, so I will not try to summarize, except I really appreciate your reference to technology, the manner in which the mobile phone so amazingly increased the reachability to population, and how this can be brought to the climate space to make sure that there is identification, scalability of prototypes at the local level that offer solutions, whether it is housing, food, clothing, truly taking us back to reality, grounding us in the principles of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and where we are with this. So thank you, Mirabel. And then you very nicely led me into Moki's question, which is our fourth panelist in this section. And Moki, I know you have said to me, I am not a climate person. I am not an expert in this area. Do not ask me anything on this question, otherwise I will magically disappear from the screen. So my question is not going to be about climate technically. It's going to be about, based on what you have heard, based on what you hear on a daily basis. Those of you who have not seen Moki must definitely look her up on her YouTube and her channels, where she has traversed the most easy, luxurious, as well as the most difficult and hard-going areas of Africa, but continues to tell the Africa story as truly an African. My question to you, Moki, is how do you show this phoenix out of the ashes? How do ordinary Africans start speaking about climate change? Is COP26 even on the radar for most of the people as you have traversed this continent? And if not, knowing the grave consequences of it from your perspective, what can we start to do now? What's the narrative?
Monica, really great question, and thank you for asking it. I think most people, and again, it's always dangerous when you try and speak for a whole continent. I think there's a big percentage of Africans that don't and have not really engaged with COP26. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think COP26 it's a technical conference. It's been perceived that way. But what I think COP26 has done, and has done very, very well, is that it's created a hanger for which we can hang conversations about climate change on. Because if you look at sort of media, pre COP26, in the build up to COP26, during it and after, there was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of stuff going on about climate. How much of that is happening on the continent is another thing. So something that African No Filter does, and African No Filter, we're a narrative change organization. So we're trying to figure out what are people talking about? What are the conversations people have? So we do things like we look at Google searches. So if you want to really know what people are worried about, look at their search history. We also monitor Twitter conversations where we can. Obviously, countries like Nigeria, not really on Twitter. But what we found, that out of 41 countries that were searching searching climate terms, only 9 of them were in Africa. That's the one side of it. The other side of it, and you've alluded to data on the number of people in Africa who are aware of climate change issues. I cite a 2019 Afrobarometer survey that said 4 out of 10 Africans know very little about climate. So if they know very little about climate and they're not searching for it on Google searches, because we know that the most popular searches are actually related to jobs in Africa. And that comes up consistently, time and time again, across multiple countries. So they're not searching for it, which speaks to me of a lack of general interest and relevance, I would say. Now, if you look at all the sort of Africa coverage that we've been sort of monitoring and looking at over this whole sort of, last couple of years, there's 2 ways that Africa tends to show up in climate discussions, and they're 2 polar extremes. One is the one that you saw at COP26 this year. This is Africa in gray suits, politicians, leaders. They're negotiating, they're talking about finance, they're talking about carbon emissions, about carbon targets, and all of these things that are a little bit distant from your average African, even though we are impacted by it. And the conversation is really about, very much about financing. There is very little conversation back home about what the financing is going to be for. There's very little conversation generally by these leaders about what the climate, the NCDs or NDCs, I'm not a climate change person, but I know that each country has to put their plans up. There is limited conversation, and for good reason. There are other priorities. We've talked about the development priorities of the continent. So that's the one framing. The second framing is one that's sort of been consistent. And I don't want to label the BBC, but it's something that you tend to see with a lot of BBC stories where they're sort of looking for evidence of climate change. And that's what I call, that's the victim narrative, or the victim framing of Africa. It's the fisherman with no fish. It's the farmer that's that he's had a drought. There's no crops. There's no food. So it's very much so the traditional stereotypical way that we've always perceived Africa. So those in a way are the 2 extremes, and that is always sort of in every article that and we've all said it today, that Africa is the most vulnerable of all the places. It'll be the hardest hit. Because of the poverty, we'll probably feel it more. But the challenge with that is that there's a big group of people in the middle that just don't engage with this. Now, what we actually have found is that when we've looked at media coverage that sort of said climate and had Africa or an African country in it, we realized that there are climate conversations going on. And I'll give you an example in Madagascar. Madagascar's had probably some of the worst sort of drought and famine in the last 40 years. They're talking about that in the context of climate. When Nigeria was going through the Fulani herdsmen, I'm not even sure if that's still happening now, but where there was, it started off as a conflict story, and a story of, herdsmen killing farmers. Over time, it evolved into a story of climate. because the herdsmen were moving around and they were moving into areas that they didn't used to be in, because there was no land, there was no water to feed their animals. It became a story of climate, and Nigerians engaged with it because they engaged with that story of the Fulani herdsmen. We're seeing it in Kenya when they're talking about tea. Tea is, it's a huge industry for Kenya. They're talking about the effects of climate on tea crops. So we're seeing it in places where it's very, very sort of specific. And the reason why I think that's important is that you can see the impact of that, because with all of this financing, all the money that everyone's talking about, there's been one country on the continent that has received funding, and that is Gabon. And the reason I believe Gabon has been able to secure that is that they tied climate directly back to something that was so intrinsic and so topical in their country. The forests employ the bulk of the population. It's a great source of revenue for them. But what was key was that it had huge political will behind it. The minister was an expert. He was an environmentalist, had been in the industry for years and years, knew his stuff. And he was focused. He was told that you need to go and get that funding for us. So I think those are the kinds of things that we need on the continent. And, the one thing that I want to end with is that climate is science. The language around it is technical. It's not easy for your layman to understand. And when I look at what happened at COP and how I accessed information about climate, it was really through news stories. Journalists had a huge role to play in interpreting that technical language, interpreting all the sort of negotiations, where we are, who said what. So when you look at that and you come back to the continent, where are our environmental journalists? Where are our climate journalists? We have very few of them. And in fact, the few that there are doing a little bit of work. I heard one, who's got a podcast. She's doing a lot of stuff in Nigeria, but she was saying that people were saying, "What are you doing writing about climate?" She's like this lone ranger doing this job. So I think we need to prioritize better storytelling. There are solutions happening in Africa. Where are the stories of the innovators? We need to cover this stuff, because if not, it comes back to the narrative that Africa is broken, Africa is dependent, and Africans lack agency. Those are the three things that consistently show up in that stereotypical image about the continent. So let me stop there.
So I could listen to you forever. And I think you're a great segue. I still have not received any questions through the chat. And I'd like to say we do have another set of questions for our panelists, but please, we implore you, this is about the audience as much as it is about the panelists sharing with us their experiences, knowledge. So Moki, you started off by saying this is not your area. Listening to you, this is exactly your area. I am being told, we have to be technology, that I have been sent the questions on, okay, please repost them, tech team, into the chat, because they don't seem to have come through on my WhatsApp. So just repost the questions in the chat. Thank you. But I do want to say to Moki, it is a challenge to you. It is also a challenge to the chair of ACET, in that listening to you speak, you should be our storyteller. We need to de-technicalize this conversation, because it is about our daily lives. It is affecting the lives of the Fulani herdsmen that you've mentioned. It is affecting the lives of the people that Mirabel has mentioned, but we are not speaking the language that they relate to.
I
think there is a massive role for you here to really, really talk to ACET, and this is an afterthought, to start to put this message out and release the ownership.
Donica, can I just add one more thing? Because I think there's a huge role, apart from journalists, there's a huge role for activists to play. And, we have our own, Africa has its own Greta Thunberg and it's Vanessa Nketa from Uganda. But we looked at a lot of her tweets, and she's doing an amazing job, and I don't want to knock her, but her tweets and her conversation is very global. I haven't seen her point to Uganda specifically and say, what does Uganda need to do? And I think there's a big aspect of how we need to localize these conversations. We need to bring them to where we are. And I think Africa is very used to, joining a global conversation and talking about things that, we talk about them because they give us money to talk about them. But increasingly, we're seeing that people are beginning bit by bit to care, but we need the data. We need researchers to research what the issues are. We need proper policies, all of these things we need, but it starts with knowledge of and relevance to. I'll only read an article if it's relevant, if it's interesting. So that's where we need to train up journalists. So there are things we can do, and it's low-hanging fruit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Moki, for that. And with that, I'm going to call, because I think you have also posed a challenge, research, data, information is one of the very strengths that ACET actually has to offer to the continent. So your point is very well taken on providing that out so that it can tell the story. With that, may I please ask KY Amwako, who is the brains and the founder behind ACET, and the direction in which we have taken. He has increasingly challenged us to think about the global issues. We have done gender and continue to do gender. On his mindset right now as a priority is indeed climate change and the impact of that between the confluence or the nexus between gender, climate, and some of the other issues that we're having. KY, can we have your wise words of wisdom, please? And then I know we have a few questions to take care of.
Thanks, Dolika, and thanks to all the panelists for a very great discussion, very insightful. Let me give you the perspective from ACET, why we got into this business and why this conversation is so important, particularly over the next year, and some of the things we at ACET hope to do to take over, to follow through these discussions and what happened at COP. But in terms of ACET, our fundamental goal is about Africa's economic transformation. And that's why I created this organization. And over the last 13 years, we've pushed the transformation agenda. And we've been saying growth is not enough. Africa needs to transform. So we've laid out the whole agenda for what we need to do to transform. And we track African countries' progress individually and the whole continent towards transformation. And indeed, next year, we have a major report, African Transformation Index, that will show the progress we made over the last 20 years in particular, and the challenges. So this year, we came up with the African Transformation Report, and we asked a simple question. What are some of the key challenges, factors that are going to affect the continent's transformation over the last 20 years? And the past shows that we've not been transforming fast enough. In fact, our transformation trajectory, in some cases, going backwards. So the question for us was, okay, we need to go up and push forward. And what are some of the key factors that will affect transformation? So we decided that climate could be one of them. Regional integration, jobs, and others. So that's the focus of our last African Transformation Report. And the climate issue is what we analyze. So much of the discussions are in that report. So as an advocacy organization working with policymakers, we want to use the coming year to take up the recommendations, the outcomes from COP. And that's why your conversations today is important, to have a re-advocacy with African leaders, policymakers, and the African citizens about the need. And this discussion today has been extremely useful. Some of the takeaways, for example, our development is not affecting the climate. Climate is affecting our development. That's a very powerful message. We need to seize the opportunities from climate to transform our economies, energy, infrastructure. So there are some core messages that we need to build upon. And I think the timing of this conversation is important because we're going to have COP27 next year in Egypt. So we want to drive the African narrative. and to make sure that the African narrative would drive COP27. So our priorities and our needs, but most importantly, our leaders also need to know that we need to work together. What affects one country here affects the other country, and how we come together under the African Free Trade Continental Area, for example. So we have a lot to do. And the other tool that we at ACET will use, in addition to our analytical work and all that, is the Transformation Leadership Panel. Dorica, you are a member. Maraki is a member. We have some fantastic people as members of the panel, from the World Bank to the ECA. We come together around key issues. So I want to make sure that this year, the climate, COP26, and all these conversations, we as the TLP will take these things up and have a real dialogue with our leaders and help them shape the narrative going into COP27 in Egypt. So those are some of the forward-looking items that from our perspective, I think so. This conversation is very timely, it's very helpful, and it will help us drive the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, KY. And for those of you who don't know KY, please seize whatever opportunity you can to know somebody who is so passionate about telling a different story, an upward story, as Kwame Nkrumah would say, shoulders forward and keep marching forward kind of story about Africa, that the possibility is there. He has written a book, and it is Know the Beginning Well, which talks about the development agenda about Africa. There you go. Thank you, KY. Well worth picking up. So with that, we have questions coming through. There were other questions that I had for the panel, but what I would like to do is go through the questions that we have received. I will try to allocate them as I see fit, but whoever wishes to chip in, please do. We have about 20 minutes left of this conversation, which tells me that we should have allocated a longer time frame. But the first question comes from Chirag Shamdasani. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. On the carbon marketplace point, what are some of the key foundational elements needed to make this work in a coordinated manner across the continent? Or does it even need to be at a Pan-African level? Here's a second part to the question, and that is, what are the realities? Am I getting this right? No. The second part is, how do we ensure it is developed in a manner, the carbon market that is, how do we ensure that it is developed in a manner that is integrated and consistent with the growing global demand, i.e. standardization across measurement, accreditation, etc., in what is a nascent industry? I'm going to take a pitch and throw this at Nick and Cesar, but Leslie, Mirabel, Moki, feel free to chip in. You may need to come off mute and switch on your camera, either Nick Westcott or Cesar Calderoni.
Yeah,
Nick,
sorry, I'm here. The carbon market question is quite a technical one, but it's a very important one. The carbon market should enable African countries to get more benefit from the contribution they are already making to climate adaptation or climate change. And the example that Moki cited of Gabon is a very good example of this. And in fact, there's a very small project we've been involved with that is using carbon credits to help protect the forest in the DRC, and hence a population, very small population of mountain gorillas, who are preserved because of the carbon market providing resources that enabled local communities to protect their forest rather than cut it down. So there's a very direct, practical story there. Actually, Moki, you're absolutely right. need more stories that people can relate to, not just outside the continent, but inside Africa. And this is the kind of thing we need. But it depends on there being a continent-wide and indeed global carbon market that will enable the value of these kind of projects, including renewable energy projects, to be realized by the countries across Africa. So it needs to be a global market, but it then needs to be used locally to mobilize that financing. And at the moment of global climate finance that's in the market, barely 3% comes to Africa because there aren't projects that will attract this. So there's a big task to do there in educating African governments, African communities to say, look, this is a potential, this is a possibility, but you've got to put together a credible program. And that comes back to the education that's needed so these communities can take advantage of that market. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick. And maybe in the interest of time, I will direct the next question to Leslie and Cesar. Cesar, if you can be ready to answer this one. What are the realities of how deep-seated challenges can derail realistic actions towards climate change mitigation? How can knowledge-sharing actions help us to remain on track? This comes from Enoch Achempong, who's Director of Renewable Energy Association of Ghana. Cesar? Cesar, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Regarding, I will try to focus a little bit on the last part, which is what can be done. I think there's a lot of, let me put it this way, knowledge sharing platforms already in the region. You can think about, for instance, the Regional Climate Outlook Forum that is pioneered in Africa. No? That basically they produce consensus-based, user-relevant climate outlook reports. No? And those reports are going to help countries reduce climate, at least raise awareness to try to reduce climate-related risks and support sustainable development in critical areas of economic activity. I think the use of technology in this case with the state-of-the-art satellite information and capacity are very effective to avert more serious crises or create early warnings and improve early warning systems that reduces damages and impact. These forums have facilitated some sort of regional cooperation and networking that have helped benefited sharing climate information and experience. No? I mean, information in this case is key for risk management and is key for actions in adaptation and mitigation. And over back to you.
Thank you so much, Cesar, very helpful. Leslie, do you have something to add to that piece?
Yeah. Yes, so just to complement what Cesar has already said, within the insurance industry, what we tend to find is that there is a low level of awareness regarding the benefits of insurance. So at the industry level, we need to work with the clients to increase the awareness and also make sure that they understand the value that the product can bring. And what's unique about the insurance industry is that it's already an interconnected market because you have companies that underwrite risks on the African continent, but reinsure them in the global reinsurance markets. And the global reinsurance markets are in fact an aggregation of all the markets across the world. So that facilitates the transfer of risk from one region to the other, but also the sharing of best practices between the various market participants. And we find that these market-driven solutions are also a very important part of dealing with the impact of climate change, because whatever solution we're creating also needs to be self-sustaining in the long run. Otherwise, it's just a flash in the pan and might leave people worse off if the solution is presented and then arbitrarily withdrawn at a later date.
Thank you so much for that, Leslie. And I have 3 more questions, and I would like to just mention to the audience that if we don't get to all the questions, there's one fairly long but very important question. We will follow up on our social media. If you can, and this will be at ACET, ACET for Africa, FOR Africa. We will put it in the chat as well for the rest of you so that you can follow up on any questions that we have not addressed. So I'll go to 2 questions. One is specifically for Moki. And Moki, may I ask you to keep it concise? The question is from Frederica Yorson. I love the comment, Moki, about needing to hear the stories of innovators. Many innovators are not feeling heard by their policymakers. So your gray suits analogy. So it seems there is a need for our policymakers to listen internally as well. What suggestions do you have for innovators to start engaging the media and influencing policy? And Moki, I know you have to leave us on the dot, but that's for you.
Yeah, I think a quick response to that is if you think about how stories emerge, I think there are 2 ways. One is that, innovators can do a lot more about building their profiles and showcasing their work. I happen to be on a judge on this Meaningful Business Awards, and I actually had a number of climate change innovations and people who were doing that stuff, but I wasn't even aware until I became a judge. But the other thing is that we need to do more about journalists, getting them interested. Most newsrooms are concerned about hard news, right? It's the elections, it's the political conflict, it's the disease, it's all the humanitarian crisis. That's what African media have tended to cover. And then we need to move more to soft profile pieces, which, we know because there's data that shows that actually young people are moving away from hard-hitting news towards soft news. They want to know about people, and that's how you actually connect with issues. So I think that we need to do more to educate journalists, get them finding these stories, and that's the agenda. Let's identify the climate change innovators because it helps shift the narrative that Africa is sleepwalking, as the BBC put it, sleepwalking towards a climate catastrophe. We're not. We're just not writing about it.
Moki, your passion, I think, has resonated with everybody. I know for a fact that we are not sleepwalking because I know a lot of innovative youngsters who are incubating, and I'm not age discrimination here because I am in that non-youngster category, but they're incubating, they're creating solutions to the problems of Africa within Africa. They're using technology, they're using fintech, they're using every available tool to solve the problems that are African problems, whether it's waste management, climate related, water management, all of these things. So I truly, what your answer and the passion with which you gave it truly resonates with me. And I hope resonates also with the person who asked the question, Frederica. Thanks, Moki. The last question that I tackle here is from Malonga Hazemba. And I'm going to direct this to Mirabel. Should Africa be worried at the insistence by the global north to choose more and major long-term targets, such as climate neutrality by 2050, over short-term immediate impact targets? So what is that trade-off, Mirabel, between the long-term burden on Africa, who is the lowest emitter of carbons, compared to our immediate needs?
So the short answer is that we actually need a combination of both. We need the short-term impact targets, but we also need to know where we're headed. And so I wouldn't give up both. Now, for us, we actually need more of the short term now because we're quickly growing. And as I mentioned earlier, we're expecting more innovations. And we know that what we don't measure, we might miss or not focus properly on. And so I would say that in our basket of metrics, we definitely will have the short, medium, and long-term ones, but it should be more weighted for us on the continent on the shorter term impact ones.
Sorry, I was just saying perfect, concise, to the point, Mirabel. Thank you. The longer question, and before we get to that response, I first want to thank those of our panelists who will have to drop off in the next 5 minutes. Really appreciate your contribution, your presence, and your commitment to this conversation, which is Africa's conversation, and in particular, the conversation of the youth and the future of our continent. So thank you for that, in case I lose you at the end of my closing remarks. The long question is, and it comes from Fau Willia Niang. Since 2015, there has always been talk of the Paris Agreement and its main recommendation, which was to limit global warming to 2 degrees maximum compared to the pre-industrial era. Indeed, industrial activities are largely responsible for global warming. And when we talk about industrial activities, we first think of rich countries. But should they bear the burden alone? That's an interesting question for me. Should the rich countries bear the burden alone? I'm not sure that they are bearing the burden alone, but that's the question. What role should Africa play as a weak link in the global chain? Again, different thinking. What does limiting the temperature rise to 2 degrees mean for Africans? What impact do global agreements to limit global warming have on the pace of development in African countries? Will the funds promised by the main polluting countries to enable Africans to adapt to the effects of climate change actually arrive? Crucial questions that deserve clear answers. So there's like 5 questions in that one statement. What I'm going to do in the interest of time is ask each panelist in a very brief 30-second sentence, try to answer that any part of that submission. As I said, we will put that submission out into the public space and it will be answered. But as a closing, I would really love for each of you, and I'll start with Nick, I'm looking at you in order of how you appear on my screen. Comment, reaction to that last statement. Long statement, 5 questions in one.
Thank you. The point I would like to make is that, replying also to you, Dolika, Africans are already adapting to climate change. They have no option because it is already happening around them. But their range of options for responding is limited by what they know and what they can do. And what we must help them do through the adaptation finance, through educational processes, through discussions like this, is make them realize there's a wider range of options available if we can bring the technology solutions into Africa. And that will lead to a more productive and adaptive response that will help the world as a whole. And I think that replies to a couple of the points in the last question. We have to get this information to the people who are already on the front line of climate change, the communities, the herders, the farmers, the urban areas in Africa. Thank you.
Mirabel?
Thanks, Dolika. So part of the question asked about the burden on the global south, and it's not a burden on just the global north or south. It's a burden on all of us here on this panel and elsewhere, and our daily choices in our work, in our personal lives. And so it's taking this conversation that has been had at COP26 on this panel and really embedding it into everything we do so that at national level and global level, we catalyze the key findings and move them beyond what the youth groups at COP26 refer to as the blah, blah, blah into action. And that is what we really need. We need action. We have a fairly good view about the policies and the general direction. We know that we're aiming for 1.5 degrees maximum. What do we do now? And access the financing and make those innovations to get us to that point.
Thank you, Mirabel. Let me go to Leslie.
So I'll pick up on the question on whether Africa can industrialize without relying on fossil fuels. My simple answer to that is we have no option but to do it. It has never been done before, but just given the position we are in now vis-a-vis climate change, we cannot afford to industrialize using fossil fuels, because in the end, what's all the economic development worth if we don't have a planet to live in?
Thank you, Leslie. And I would piggyback on that and just say already electric cars are the way to go. So those of us who are buying cars that still run on petrol, we need to start thinking about where we're going to sell those cars in the next 5 years. And as the world usually goes, Africa will become the dump site. And so we better start thinking about those things. The trend is what it is. We have to find a way of how Africa survives and leapfrogs the challenges that we're facing today. Cesar.
Thanks, Olika. I will try to focus a little bit on the climate finance and what is the role of the World Bank in this fight. The World Bank has put let me put it this way, have put more effort into trying to integrate climate and developing that in a number of fronts. I think we have to realize that development projects need to connect people to economy to the planet. Some of the things that the bank is doing, for instance, currently they are launching the country climate and development reports. This is a core diagnostic that is already being developed for some of the countries in the region, for example, Angola, Rwanda, Mozambique, Ghana, the G5 in the Sahel. And they will lay out a blueprint for countries to deliver both in climate and development goals, and it's going to help countries identify and prioritize the investments that are best suited for their needs. These CCDRs, or these climate reports, are going to be public, so that donors, lending institutions and companies can also use them as a guidance for investment. And finally, and I will stop here, the bank has also set a target to commit more than 1/3, around 35% of its overall financing to climate change over the next 5 years. Of this climate finance, at least half of it will go to climate adaptation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think Moki has dropped off the line, so we unfortunately will not be able to hear her very passionate way of dealing with these things. But it is 2 minutes past our closing time, and I would like to thank you all for joining, and thank you for these incredibly deep thinking questions. My suggestion to the ACET team, TLP, and NEPAD, AUDA, we will try to get to these again and maybe publish some kind of Q&A or facts, questions, answers on our website to what have been very, very important suggestions, discussions, questions. We have heard some important points on the narrative. I think it is boiling down to the narrative, making it real for the missing middle, that sits between the gray suits and the poverty story. We've heard the importance of leadership, policy making. We've heard the importance of money, that the money has got to flow into the ability of Africa to adapt, related to the last question or sets of questions from the last submission. We've heard about the relationship and the integratedness of climate and development and economics and policies related there too. We have heard about the importance of resilience, the protection of the most vulnerable, safeguarding the SDGs, if I can encapsulate it in that way, through insurance and other tools and methods. We have heard that the carbon market should allow Africa to get more benefit for what it is giving. I really like that expression. I think it came from Nick. And then the importance of the combination of the basket of looking at and balancing the trade-offs between short-term, long-term, and medium-term responses for Africa vis-a-vis climate, as well as the needs from an impact perspective. And I love also, again, what I heard, that Africans are already adapting. We just need to build this up. And I would end by saying, again, it is about the 3 Ps. It is about people who are definitely affected, which is all of us. It is about this planet, which is one of the biggest assets that Africa holds, whether it's tourism or it's minerals or waterways, whatever it is. It is also about partnerships. We are in this together and we have to work together. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists once more, thank our technical team behind the scenes who made this all happen, but most importantly, thank all of you who have taken the time out of your day to be with us, to share the knowledge and to hear the stories. And we hope that you will continue to follow this conversation going forward. Thank you so much.